Hi everybody, Old Pastor Paul on the Nonpartisan Evangelical YouTube channel. I wanted to do a little bit longer version of the video that I did on TikTok in two parts because the answer to Matthew 19 is just more nuanced than you can do in 60 or 120 seconds. So Adam, thank you for the very kind and challenging question. And I also want to say to you, I love your humble heart, but you and I both know you're not ignorant. But thank you for the heart nonetheless. So let's talk about Matthew 19 and the premise that Adam shared with me, saying, is it not feasible to say that Jesus is saying in Matthew 19 that the only relationships that God, let me make sure I wrote it, the only true relationship to God is man and woman. And my answer to Adam on that was, is that answer feasible? Yes, it's feasible. Do I believe it's likely or true? No. And here's what I said why. Because Matthew 19 is not a conversation about marriage. It's about divorce. And actually, it's not even about that. It's actually just a story of, once again, the Pharisees coming and trying to draw Jesus into the divisive issues of the time. Divorce was a huge argument. There were those who believed you could put a woman away for any reason whatsoever, and others who believed, no, only, in adultery can you do it. And so there was just this huge struggle on, like there were on so many issues. And what the Pharisees always wanted to do was to get Jesus on one side or the other. And they really didn't care which side he chose. They just wanted to be able to marginalize him. And so that's why they asked him about taxes and the woman caught in adultery, because they wanted to get Jesus on one side of the argument or the other, so they could try to leverage him against one side of the argument or the other. And every time Jesus refused to answer in the way that they answered. And if you guys watch my comment string on my videos on my TikTok page or even on Facebook, you'll see people all the time, they'll say, gay people going to hell, yes or no? Gay people in heaven, yes or no? Gay people ordained, yes or no? Because they want to try to leverage me on one side of an argument or another. And I think God's view of those things has much greater nuance than simple yes, no answers. And part of the problem in the evangelical church is we're looking for simple black and white yes, no answers on everything. And so often because of that, we get it wrong, just like the Pharisees got it wrong. And Jesus had to point it out. So in Matthew 19, when they ask him, Jesus, is it okay for us to divorce our wives? Jesus did what he always does when faced with a question from the Pharisees. He takes them back to their original premises. And so when the rich young ruler came to Jesus and says, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus gave him a list of rules. Now, if we just took that list of rules and we said, here, look, this is what Jesus says are the ways to get to heaven. Look at it. It's a verse in the Bible. That's what it said. We could make the case that it's feasible, but we would be wrong because we wouldn't understand the premise of what Jesus was doing. He was taking what the rich young ruler believed and holding it up to him, and then he would break that down as a straw man with another aspect of God's character. And with the rich young ruler, he said, here's the rules. And the rich young ruler was like, yes, I've done all those things. Isn't that amazing? And Jesus is like, oh, and you have to sell everything you have and give it to the poor, because he knew that pride of his righteousness making him wealthy was a thing. So when Jesus says marriage is between one man and one woman, he's not necessarily, now I could make the argument that he's using that as a side note, and it is a definitive statement. So I'm not saying Adam is absolutely wrong, but what I believe is he's actually just setting up a premise to knock it down with another message that is a vision of what God's heart is, a characteristic of God's heart that he wants to show the Pharisees that shows their hypocrisy. And I actually think it's a lot of what God would do today, or what Jesus would do today if he were on earth, with our idea of homosexuality. He would set it up as a premise. You've heard it said, but I say, and he would knock it down with God's grace. And that's exactly what he does in Matthew 19. They're saying, is it okay to divorce? And he's saying, well, let's go back to the original premise. And now let me knock that down with God's grace. And what he's saying is, your teaching, and of course, this is a little bit of my translation, but what he ultimately is saying to them is, your teaching, sorry, I just had my camera, my phone do something funky there. He says, your teaching says that if a man's wife is caught in adultery, he has to put her away. But I'm telling you, that's not God's heart. He gave you that exception through Moses because he understands how hard-hearted and human you are, and he has grace for that humanness. And so he allowed this, but it was never his premise from the start. And he goes on then to explain all these other things about God's premise. And one of the things he says at the end of that in verse 12 is this thing about there are some born eunuchs, there are some made eunuchs by man, and there are some that decide to become eunuchs. And in that, now that's really an arguable passage of what Jesus is saying there, but part of what he's saying is, oh, by the way, guys, your belief that a man has to get married or he's violating God's law, that's wrong too, because some people are born not to get married. And that's a really interesting thing when we start getting into the homosexuality discussion, because if I say, well, God made some not to get married, could he not have made some to have some other pull or desires in their heart and in their sexuality? So Jesus is saying here, you say, but God says. You say, but God's grace says. So Jesus is not making definitive statements about marriage. He's taken the premises of the Pharisees and he's knocking them down with God's grace. And if God was able to have that grace around divorce and marriage back then in Matthew 19, by the way, this idea that marriage is between one man and one woman, as Jesus said, you know who disagreed with that premise? King David disagreed with that. He had multiple wives, and God never once said, you're bad for doing that. Abraham had multiple wives and a concubine that he had sex with, and God didn't say, hey, it's illegal for you to do that. God was saying, I understand your culture now. I'm really angry that you took your promise into your own hands with Hagar, the slave girl, but he didn't chide him for having sex with a woman that was not his wife. I believe because God flows with us in our culture and understands our hard-heartedness, the Bible calls it, our humanness, I would call it today. And because he understands that he has grace beyond anything we've ever imagined. Listen, guys, here's the thing that I'm saying in that Jesus never mentioned gay marriage or homosexuality, and that God only mentions it 3 times in the New Testament. Why is it such a big priority for us? Because if homosexuality was as big a priority with God as it is with the evangelical church, wouldn't Jesus have mentioned it at least once? I mean, I think if it mattered to God as much as it matters to us, Jesus would have been mentioning it all over the place. And the fact that he never once mentioned it, I think is pretty significant. Now, here's one thing I always say. He may have mentioned it once. The one time when he said, hey, Capernaum was a city where Jesus headquartered and did more miracles than any other city. And he says to them, hey, Capernaum, you know Sodom is going to have a better judgment day than you. That may have been a mention of homosexuality and saying, hey, if you see my miracles and don't fall into my story of relationship with God, you're going to have a worse judgment day than Sodom. Yeah, that could be an issue there too. If Matthew 19 was treated by evangelicals the way the scriptures that we interpret about homosexuality, no-fault divorce would be the number one thing we'd be going after in Christendom these days. And no divorced person could be a pastor, Sunday school teacher, board member, or maybe even an attendee of our churches. Man, God had great grace, Jesus was saying to them, around divorce and marriage. Can he not have great grace around some of these issues for us today? Was Jesus not teaching in Matthew 19, you've heard it said that these things are true, but I am telling you something totally different, that God has grace for all of those things that you think can't be covered up. He was always bringing the alternative. And honestly, guys, I'm no deep theologian. I'm not trying to argue theological biblical concepts. I'm trying to say, how do we take the Bible and apply it to people today so it doesn't crush them, but brings them into connection and relationship to God, so his Spirit can guide them into all truth. His Spirit will point out the things we're doing that are wrong for us. We don't have to do it every day, all the time, and condemn people with our words. So Adam, I appreciate your question. It was very kind and heartfelt, and I hope I've answered it with just as much love and heartfelt sympathy for your position and respect for who you are, and explaining well the reasons I disagree. Bless you all. Have a good night.